My name is Ruffin Rhodes.
My name is Nanyela Obodo.
My name is Stanley Evans II.
My name is Kelly Addison.
I am Black.
I am a professional.
And I'm an architect.
And it all matters.
Good evening. I'm Tim Johnson, president of NOMA Orlando. And welcome back. And thank you again for joining us this evening on another episode of Inside Voices Black Thoughts. Inside Voices Black Thoughts is a series of discussions held virtual to reach a larger audience base. It is here we share and discuss matters affecting our profession from a perspective not often heard, the Black perspective. In this forum, we discuss thoughts about how to improve ourselves and the profession. Due to our small number of Black voices that are sometimes not represented around the table, addressing these wide-ranging topics, IVBT hopes to give a voice expressing thoughts from the Black professional's perspective. Having said that, we're not the voice of all Black people. The voices and the views expressed here are views based on our experience. We want it to be free and not restricted. This evening, our topic is redlining and gentrification, repurpose and revitalize. Tonight, we want to put a red line through gentrification and replace it with community revitalization. This is episode 2. We encourage all of our listening audience to go back and visit our first episode on the BAM website. In this episode, we want to discuss how we repurpose and revitalize to avoid redlining and gentrification. I'd like to remind our panelists and audience about the sensitive nature of these conversations. So let's keep this conversation respectful. We understand that our views are not uniform, we differ, and to move the conversation, we ask that you show each other latitude for mistakes and understanding that we all mean well. We want to thank our sponsor for this evening, Mr. Evan St. Louis, who is the father of our moderator for this evening. We'd also like to acknowledge and thank our various organizations that have collaborated to make Inside Voices Black Thoughts come to reality. BAM Orlando for initiating the IVBT idea, NOMA Orlando, South Florida NOMA, BAM Miami, AIA Orlando, or the Orlando Foundation for Architecture, and AIA Miami. These professional organizations mentioned have realized this issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion is an issue to be attacked from all angles, and working together is one way of bringing attention to the fact that it is a more diverse, that will make our profession a more diverse and inclusive profession, will also result in a better society. Our moderator for this evening is Ms. Nadine St. Louis. Nadine is the Vice President of South Florida NOMA, and she's going to ask questions of our panelists. Let's welcome Nadine at this time.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Check the floor, Nadine. Go for it.
Tim, thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Today, we're going to have a difficult discussion. It's going to be about gentrification. It's going to be about redlining. Now, these topics are not the easiest topics to discuss, but as minority community, we have to talk about them. Our panelists are amazing, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about it. As I said, this is season 3, episode 3, and our topic is to repurpose and revitalize. So what that means is we're going to talk about redlining and gentrification. Now, I'm going to take you back a little bit because since this is part 2, which is redlining, part 1 was about gentrification. And we need to explain what gentrification is before we can even begin to understand what redlining is. So the root word of gentrification is gentry. And the etymology of gentry is the upper class. Now, understanding that gentrification comes from the idea of upper class, what gentrification implies is the displacement of minority groups, or what is considered lower class by the upper class, or what is considered upper class at coming into a neighborhood and taking out all the people of minorities in that area. Keeping that idea in mind, now we're going to talk about redlining. Historically, redlining was a systemic denial of services. In 1935, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, or FHLBB, requested that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, create residential security maps. Now, this affected 239 cities. Now, in these maps, there were different diagrams and different areas that were quarantined off or redlined, and these areas were considered places that bankers should not invest in. In 1960, John McKnight coined the idea of redlining and described it as fencing off areas. Luckily, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act made it illegal for redlining, and it made it legal to do these, to deny minorities or Black people the ability to buy a home in any neighborhood. An example of one of these residential security maps is what you see here. This area is Atlanta, and it was the map created in 1938. Now, the map was quarantined in 4 different sections. A, which was green, which was considered the best area to invest by banks. B was the blue areas, that was considered still desirable. C, the yellow areas were areas that were considered to be declining, and D were red areas. Those areas were considered hazardous. In these areas, it was very difficult to get a loan. It was very difficult to have public services. It was next to impossible. If you see on the map, or you take a really good close look at the map, you'll notice that there's a lot more yellow and red than there is blue and green. And even taking into consideration blue and green, there's a lot less green than there is blue. Now, the HOLC also graded these areas. If you take a look at this graph, we're comparing the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the West. In these color categories, you'll see that middle to upper homes were best in each category and hazardous in mostly low to income neighborhoods. Now this map hit home. So this map was more, or this graph was more comparing white versus minority. Now you see large percentages of whatever was white or desirable were best and desirable. So it was better if it was a white neighborhood. It was more desirable, it was a white neighborhood, no matter if you were in the Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. Now, if you were a minority, no matter if you were in the Northeast, Midwest, South, or West, you can see the drastic change. You were undesirable, and it was a declining area, considered hazardous. So if you were a minority, the idea was you were not getting a house loan. You were not getting services. Just think about that. This was 1938 to 1968. This was the time my parents were alive. This was the time your grandparents were alive. It was difficult to own a house. It was difficult to do the things that we take for granted today. This story is a historic area in New York. It's Levittown. Now, this is very personal to me because I come from New York. Levittown was literally maybe 15 minutes away from my house. The story about Levittown, or how it came about, was Mr. Abraham Levitt in 1947 decided to purchase acres of farmland and create homes at low cost for veterans of World War II. Now, you would think that would be a great thing for the community. However, caveat was that these houses or these homes were only to be sold to Caucasian, people of the Caucasian race. Now, that wasn't just out of mouth. That was written into your deed. The deed of the home you purchased stated that you could not sell it to anyone that was not Caucasian. The sad part about this deed is that if you know anything about deeds, they stay with the house. So many of these houses today still have that language written into their deed. Now, it's illegal, they don't follow it, but the fact that the language is still there says something about it. There was one African-American family that decided to break the mold and decided they wanted to sublet in this area. They were evicted in December of 1953. There were signs in that area that said, "We want white tenants in our white communities." That white tenants in your white communities, you couldn't, just the sheer thought of that is beyond disrespectful. And it doesn't make sense to me today. And I see how it happened then, but it still doesn't make sense in any case. There was people fighting and said that in this, they fought for Mr. Carter. And they said that equality starts at the home, right? So this is your house and they're telling you you can't live there. Now you would think that this was a 1947s thing. This is not happening today, but it is. In 2020, still the demographics in Levittown is 82.7% white, only 1.2% African-American. Then ask yourself, what changed, or did it? Now, redlining is considered outlawed. Is it really outlawed, or has it changed form? Now, you can't outright say that you're redlining anywhere anymore. However, what happens now is that they don't tell you you can't purchase here. They just make it more difficult for you to live there. So in modern times, what redlining has become, it's just become a conflict between longtime residents, the people who have established these neighborhoods, and the new up and coming people coming in. And what exactly happens is that these areas are cheaper to buy into. So people with wealth or that have more money come in, they purchase land, they start buying up different areas, start renovating different shops. And now the market value comes up in these areas. Because the market value comes up, now the people who originally lived there, it's very difficult to pay their rent. And the people who thought that they could finally move into these areas, all of a sudden can't. So at the end of the day, whether you're saying you're redlining or you're doing it under the covers through this means, it's still an idea of displacement. These are some additional reading sources that you can use to help educate yourselves and educate other people about redlining. A great book is The Color of Law, Forgotten Government. That one really shows what gentrification is and really outlines what redlining is today. Now, taking all of that, understanding what gentrification is, bringing that into redlining, we're going to have a discussion tonight. We're going to talk about it all. We're going to talk about what we can do. We're going to talk about what we should do. And we're going to talk about how it affects us, how it affects our communities, and how it affects our future, the children that we hope to bring into the world. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Carlton Eley. He has been here through part 1 and now has graciously joined us for part 2. Carlton Eley is a national expert on equitable development. Mr. Eley was named the 2021 Sojourner Truth Fellow for the Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. I say humbly thank you and welcome, Mr. Eley.
Good evening, Nadine. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Jessica Burns. Ms. Jessica Burns is a practicing attorney in both Florida and Georgia. She is a past member of the Downtown Development and CRA Advisory Board, and she is the president and CEO of RL Burns Construction. Welcome, Mrs. Burns, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nadine. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I have the pleasure of welcoming Mrs. Jaime Perkins. Mrs. Jaime Perkins is the Vice President for the West Augustine Youth Development Organization, which impacts over 200 children annually. She is currently employed with the City of St. Augustine as the CRA Administrator. Mrs. Jaime Perkins, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, Nadine. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much. And last but absolutely not least is Mr. Ashon Nesbitt. He is the Chief Programs Officer and Technical Advisor for the Florida Housing Coalition. He also provides technical support and assistance to local governments. Mr. Nesbitt, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Nadine.
Well, everybody, there's a lot to talk about today. What I would like to do is toast to everyone today. I definitely have my drink of choice tonight. But let's get this conversation started. So with the idea of redlining, I would like to open this to Mr. Carlton Eley. Have you been personally affected by redlining in your area or an area that you are aware of? Has something affected you personally as Levittown affected me?
Thank you for asking that question, Nadine, and thank you for hosting this courageous conversation. And I think as an African-American and as an urban planner, I can say that, yeah, redlining has affected me, perhaps not in a way that is as obvious as some of the ways that you were characterizing in your introduction. But one of the things that's important to note is that redlining as an act has legacy implications. So you encourage a policy that discriminates and denies people access to mortgages and to loans, and then that cascades into basically communities being put in a compromised economic condition. And that level of atrophy that occurs because of that will express itself in different ways. I spent a number of years working on issues of environmental justice, which looks at how minority and low-income communities may bear the disproportionate burden of pollution. Well, environmental justice extends beyond just toxics. It also includes untenable conditions in housing and land use and infrastructure and in sanitation. So many communities that are dealing with the burden of environmental injustice, one of the contributors to that injustice has actually been redlining as well. And so that's the way I would respond to your question in terms of how I've been affected or how I've been to communities that have been affected is because of working on the topic of environmental justice for many years. Sometimes persons perceiving that their main problem is pollution, but not connecting the dots to how those conditions of injustice are actually connected to bad planning decisions, bad policy decisions, and regressive policies like redlining.
So taking that into consideration, policies, right? So what happens, or how can we change these policies? What do we do to get involved into these policies? And that I open to everyone on the table. So Jaime, Ashon, Jessica, please let me know your thoughts.
I think it's about getting involved in in voting in our community, electing officials that are going to have clear and concise agendas, being intentional in their practices and the policies that they create. I will even go as far as to say electing officials that have outright Black agendas that will positively impact Black and African American people and marginalized communities within the areas. And I want to make sure that that we clarify that it's not, we need to vote at all levels. but we need to really press the issue when we start talking about local elections where we're really affected in our communities. When we start talking about city and county commission, when we're talking about, state level governors, state representatives, things of that nature. Those are the important roles. Of course, we want to elect a national leader, a president that's going to be fitting to our agendas and things of that nature, because federal law does trickle down to us. But some of the most important, impactful policies are made in our city commission offices and in our county commission offices. And those are some of the places where I think it's really important to start having those conversations about policy and home rules and how those redlining things affect our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of it is about educating the community as well. I think educating the community, educating businesses, and even the banking and finance community. So much about why redlining and gentrification has been able to stay alive as long as it has is because these sectors don't understand the cultural changes that happen and how that affects the economics of a community. And when it affects the economics of one community, it ends up affecting all of us. So if all of us have an interest in that, solving that problem, then we need to start educating ourselves and understanding how these policies affect long-term, generation to generation, and how it just depletes resources and depletes like a cultural heritage.
To your point too, Jessica, I want to add that we talk about educating these industries and the banking industries and things of that nature. But this is where we keep hearing that term, representation is so important. Representation is so important. It's so important to have people at the table that look like you, because you really won't have to do all that deep dive educating of industries when you have somebody at the table that can say, hey, that's not right. There are people who look like me that aren't going through this, or people that look like me that are dealing with this. We should change our policies and our whatever products that we're selling or that we're using to help this community to look more like this, because this is how people in this community are really being impacted. I grew up there, or things of that nature. I work for the city of St. Augustine, recently employed there, came to the city as a independent project manager, ran my own company for 7 years. And there's nobody in management at the city of St. Augustine that is a person of color, except for myself. And that is really crazy to me in 2021 when you think about it, that there are people in positions of authority, leaders in official and unofficial capacity that are making decisions from the top down for people that they don't even know, have never lived the life that they live, don't understand their background or their culture or anything, but they're making these decisions. So when we start talking about representation is important, we really should really start thinking about how we infiltrate those industries and bring educated people like ourselves to the table to make some decisions that will positively impact communities.
Now that is an amazing.
Jump in and say that I agree with you, Jaime, about going back to local issues. It's so important. We come out big for the presidential elections, but it's those local issues. Carlton, your planner, that the land use, those types of issues that really affect our day-to-day are really made by city commissions and county commissions. Right. And these are the issues that we're usually the least informed about. But we know about, the presidential, their agendas, but we don't know, what, our city councilmen, what agenda they're running on, or, the people that really are closer to what really affects us on a day-to-day basis. And so, and our vote is so powerful, and we really need to understand and make that connection. And also, as far as the industry is concerned, we have the history of redlining, but how many people make the connection between those policies, institutionalized racism to what the reality is today, and what they see in their cities. And understanding, in 1935, or 34, when the act that created FHA, it at the same time, created an opportunity for one group to affordably get into home ownership, the GIs and those coming out, and excluded a whole group You know, I can relate. My own grandfather lived in a red line community, a very nice house, but he never owned it because he couldn't buy in that community.
Wow.
And so, you know, how that translated to my parents being first generation homeowners, and having to wait and couldn't purchase until the late 70s.
Wow.
And they purchased in the formerly red line community. And so, you know, all of that, you know, but, you know, we don't understand how that relates to us individually, how that created what we see in the physical, was been built in the built environment, from a planning perspective, how, you know, those red line communities also were the same places where dumping was allowed, where, you know, all of the noxious uses were allowed, and not having representation on our commissions allowed a lot of that stuff to happen in these communities. And so it just compounded. And so really, you know, understanding first, you know, the power of our vote at the local level, and then in every industry, understanding how, you know, every industry was complicit in creating the environment that we see today. And so, you know, every industry needs to be just as intentional about, you know, undoing the effects of the things that happened in the past.
Now,
Yeah, I want to agree that Ashon raises a great point. And Nadine, you made this point in your introduction as well, because in the present, we often have conversations about the issue of gentrification, but it's important to note that the seeds for what we're dealing with in the present may go as far back as 70 years ago. I mean, especially if we start to acknowledge how you have the redlining policies. When they run their course, they basically dry up a community and depreciate property values. And then that basically sets up the conditions for communities to be gentrified out of existence. So there is no division or divide between these two trends, especially when it comes to the African-American community. It seems as if one is a setup for the other. And Lisa Bates, she is a professor at Portland State University. She has actually done research on this topic, and on her website, she actually has a diagram that frames this relationship between the severe redlining, which basically dries up a community, versus the gentrification that eventually occurs because the property values have been depressed, and it basically sets up the scenario for investors to come in and acquire land structures at a very low cost that in turn are redeveloped at a very high premium.
now, everybody, I love talking about we need to educate each other, right? But then to educate each other means you have to go to these board meetings to hear what they're talking about, right? But what happens when these convenient board meetings are held at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Because I've seen them held at 4 o'clock. But I'm working these two jobs because I got these kids that are hungry, right? And I got this mortgage I gotta pay, and I got all these things to do. But these board meetings are conveniently held at times where, for minorities, it's a struggle to get there. Now, if you're in an affluent, if you're lucky in an affluent area where you don't work every day, it's okay. You can go to these meetings at 4 o'clock. You can show up. But when I can't, what do you say then? How do we deal with that then? And Jaime, I really want to hear from you because I know you're a mom. So this will hit home for you because you understand the struggle of I got to get dinner on the table and I got to make sure everybody's in bed at a certain time.
I never really answer a question with a question, Nadine, but my question right back to you is how? and then I would even pose a second question to say, is it strategic that they're doing these meetings during these times? Here in my community, our county commission meeting starts at 11 o'clock in the morning, and that's just unreal to me. That, granted, the agenda is usually extremely in depth. It's long. It runs all day. They're probably in there from 11 till maybe 6, 7 o'clock at night. And you can go back and you can watch it live stream. You can go back and watch the video footage of the event or the commission meeting. But by that time, decisions have already been made. you have not had an opportunity to voice your opinion or stand at the podium and point your finger for 3 minutes at whatever commissioner is going against the grain or going with the grain for that matter.
You know, if I can cut in here, you know, I think for so long we've been operating in silos, right? And so you have the business community that can speak volumes when it comes to re-election and getting our local officials into office, but then you also have their constituents that have a voice and have the ability to go to the ballot box and vote them in or out. And there's not enough of gelling of the two, getting on the same page about an agenda. What do we want for our district? What's going to help our businesses grow? What's going to help keep this community intact, and then going and then having the business community being the voice of the community that's at the, you know, the 2 p.m. CRA meetings or what have you. But it's got to be a combination of the two, because I don't think business can solve the problem without constituents in the community and vice versa.
I agree.
Well, Carlton and Ashon, let me know what you think about that, because it's not only women that have to take care of these kids. Men have to take care of these kids too. So what are your thought processes on those? And yes, I'm serious, men take care of these kids too. So let me know, what are you talking about?
Well, in terms of the issue of the inconvenience of when meetings occur, there are some ways to respond to that. I mean, citizens have a responsibility to speak up and to let their elected officials know that the system isn't convenient, and to try to figure out ways in which we can have meetings at times that work for the vast majority. But when you're in environments where people aren't receptive to change, then we have to be flexible to identify other strategies, such as identify proxies, identify representatives who could speak towards our position. Sometimes it requires working through neighborhood associations, and the responsibility of that association should be to make that meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But not all communities have the same level of proficiency. I mean, there are many communities that are proficient enough and they have neighborhood associations, and some that don't. So we have to figure out where is the pressure point and what is the correction that needs to be made so that we can make sure that persons are represented and their voices can be heard, even when they're not present, but through proxy if need be. So
I think that's exactly what Jessica said. So it's kind of a reiteration of what she says is engaging other people throughout the community, business owners, to connect and collaborate with constituents within the community to be the voice. And so I think that's kind of a reiteration of that. And to go back and answer your question, Nadine, I think that's kind of how I got involved in politics and policy within my community, because there was no way for me to be involved when I was working a 9 to 5. I was commuting 30 minutes away. It wasn't until I actually started, or over an hour away actually, but it wasn't until I started my own business that I was able to say, you know what, let me show up at this meeting and see what's going on. And then I was able to start kind of paying more attention to what was going on. But when you're working and you are a mother, and in my case, a single mom, and you got football practice and tutoring and this, I mean, there's so many things going on, you really don't have time to pay attention. So it's imperative that there are leaders in the community that can go and be your voice. And I think a neighborhood association, Carlton, is one of the great ways to kind of initiate something like that, to collaborate minds and thoughts and kind of pull together.
Yeah, and it's just one of many. I mean, there are a number of different ways in which a community could approach this particular type of challenge. But leaders in the environmental justice movement tend to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we have to be mindful of the importance of being present and making sure that our voices are heard, and trying to figure out ways that we can get around some of these hurdles or barriers that in the past have inhibited our participation. One of the important things I think to note as we talk about issues of education is the fact that many of us who are part of this panel may be professionals, which means we actually have access to streams of information that often lay people don't have. And I think sometimes we take that for granted. Sometimes we get access to information we don't even lift a finger in the process, because we're constantly being informed by our peers, our coworkers, people do brown bags, there are lawyers that we have to chat with, and they're advising us on stuff. Lay people often don't have that same level of access to information. And so the importance of education, the capacity building, helping people to become more proficient, helping them to understand how they can navigate their system and how they can raise questions in order to create those pressure points that may lead to changing and modifying the time of the meeting. I mean, those type of things are very important. We shouldn't take them for granted.
I think what I would also add to that, and maybe Jessica, you can really speak to it more, is the whole legalese and the language behind how these things are written, right? Because not everybody is going to completely understand what this lawyer speak is about. Reading the code is a challenge for me, right? And I've been doing it for about 14, 15 years at this point. So someone who is not familiar with these terms, what would you say to them other than Google, right? Well, how else can we better educate ourselves as lay people about these terms so that we can pose these intelligent questions, so that we really understand what they're speaking about and the changes that are really being made?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. I mean, that's what lawyers get paid to do, right? We get paid to figure out how to interpret things and how to broaden clauses and codes to get what we want in there, and how to narrow them to keep certain things out. So we get very crafty with that. But I think, Carlton kind of hit it earlier in terms of just community organizations, right? I don't expect everybody, every lay citizen to go out and get a law degree to figure out, what causes they should get behind and which one. But community organizations like Urban League, community organizations, some that are trade specific, like Associated Builders and Contractors has a legislative update, and it kind of summarizes the position of different bills and what they're getting behind and why, similar to what you would see, during just a regular voting season for your local mayor or governor's race or something of that nature. So I think we've got to kind of boil it down, right? Let the experts and the people who do those things do that, and boil it down for the community, and provide it in a newsletter or provide it in some sort of format that gives you just enough information where you can make, an educated decision, or at least know what follow-up questions you want to go ask and what direction to go in to get those questions answered.
I want to add to that too, Jessica. I want to say YouTube and Google University ain't never hurt nobody, but don't let that be your only source of communication, or of educating yourself. But I'm definitely a Google and University advocate myself. But in connection to our professional education, or our education and our professional resume and whatnot, I think it's also important that we be good stewards of the community, and we be leaders that the community can trust, because we can have all these letters behind our names. And I thank God, for the tenacity that I had to finish college and do all those great things and stuff. But if we can't be somebody that our community constituents can trust, then we're really not going to do any good anyway. So we have to make sure that we're good stewards of the community when we start going to these, the residents of the community and providing them with information, making sure that nobody's going to walk the straight and narrow, so to speak, but that we give them something, be a person that they feel that they can depend upon, and that we're giving them, good information where they can actually see growth in what we're doing and change, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Then I have a very important question. How do you recognize the signs of redlining in your area? I don't mean the obvious signs, like there's all of a sudden here's a brand new building, or all of a sudden there's huge construction, right? What are the minute signs or the smaller signs that may go over your head, but still are things you should watch out for, that your area is starting to become redlined?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, Nadine, I think I understand your question. I just want to make sure we explain that there are two terms that we're using. and we don't want to unintentionally conflate them. There's redlining, and then there's the issue of gentrification. So I think your question was actually referring to what are the subtle signs that gentrification may be occurring that people may not always be aware of.
Correct.
And so in response to that, there sometimes is the rebranding of neighborhoods that has happened in communities. For example, you're from New York, places like Harlem in the early 2000s, all of a sudden were being rebranded as Upper Manhattan. There's also the issue of the othering that does occur, the unwelcoming type of behavior that tends to occur for activities that are innocuous. So for example, persons may have been doing something as harmless as drumming, public drumming in a park. And then all of a sudden, as the neighborhood demographics start to change, some people feel that drumming may be a nuisance. I mean, drumming is cultural expression, but some demographics who may have less of an appreciation for it may call it a nuisance. And then they criminalize the activity by calling the police on you. And so, here we are at a time where there are so many, Karens doing things. It's no surprise because they've become emboldened over the span of the past 20 years. And so we see this type of criminalization of innocuous activity, even the policy of stop and frisk, which is a policy that was really designed to basically make people not feel welcomed in communities in order to make other persons feel comfortable and safe. So now we have, policies that are being enforced in order to, that basically violate people's civil liberties. And while stop and frisk was a policing policy, it's interesting that the local planning department in the context of New York City didn't speak up about it, given the fact that planners have a code of ethics where we're supposed to speak up for equity and for justice. But because the stop and frisk policy kind of undergirded a livability strategy, the planning department really didn't say anything. That's a violation of just planning ethics altogether. So these are some of the subtle things that people tend to ignore, but we have to have conversations and just call these issues out when it comes to some of the subtle issues that people are less mindful of when a community is undergoing that process of transitioning. The unwelcoming behavior, the criminalization of innocuous activity, the rebranding of places that where a previous name was associated with a sense of place, a place-making dividend, and now all of a sudden people are trying to reinvent it, and so they offer different nomenclature in order to market that particular place. Realtors often like label places as being up and coming. That was also something that was done in Washington, D.C. So whenever a neighborhood was called up and coming, it's a clear sign that things are about to change.
Oh, Brooklyn, that's all I gotta say about that. Jaime, Jessica, what do you, and Ashon, I haven't heard from you a little bit. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I guess I come from a little bit of a academic mind. I think, tying the two, the connection between redlining and gentrification today, and just, knowing that history and how redlining created communities that are now, vulnerable to gentrification or displacement. And so I think, if I was wondering if my neighborhood was next, I will look at, what's happening in the neighborhood next to mine. I will look at, what kind of investments are being made on the edges that could eventually spill over into my neighborhood. I would look at the type of housing that's in my neighborhood. Is it, kind of historic? Does it have any historic value? And I mean any historic value. Is it, right now, houses built in the 60s are, attractive and considered, valuable. Terrazzo flooring in Florida is like, oh, you've got something. So if you've got that in your house, you might you might be, such and such little things like that. But really, paying attention to what's been happening around my neighborhood, in the adjacent neighborhood to the north or to the east or whatever, the neighborhood that's closest to downtown, and if I'm next to that, I can pretty much say my neighborhood is next. And as Carlton said, kind of the rebranding, that happened in my hometown in St. Pete. They kind of rebranded the whole South Side because you would hear on the news, South St. Pete, and everybody knew that was like the bad side of town. So they rebranded it Midtown. And so now it's Midtown. It's up and coming. It's a new, you gave it a new, fresh, name. And, that was 20 years ago. And we're seeing the fruits of that right now. But if people had caught on to that, then they would have known, we need to get ready. We need to start putting things in place to prevent, what's now hyper gentrification that's happening in a lot of the neighborhoods in Midtown. So, that's a real NOMA, that's gentrification is coming.
How do you get ready? What do you put in place?
Oh, we would say, I think, it's time for the community to organize. In my organization, we really support, the community land trust model. And I support it from a purist standpoint, meaning the community coming together, and we're going to take ownership of assets together so that we control what happens in our community, or we have a sense together what's going to happen in our community. You're from the Northeast, Nadine. You probably heard of Dudley Street Initiative in Boston, which is like, I love that example. In the 80s, the community came together, they saw the writing on the wall, and they banded, they organized, and they got control of property. I wouldn't suggest this in Florida, but they actually pressured the city to give the community the power of eminent domain. That's kind of extreme, but that was the extreme levels they were willing to go to make sure that their community was preserved and that identity was preserved. And so, that resulted in them owning thousands of properties in their community that they still control today. And so, that's, the type of mindset we have to have. Maybe I can't by myself do it, but, 10 of us getting together can do it. And, and if all thousands of us come together, we can really do something. And so, I think that's the kind of thing, but you have to be thinking 20 years down the road and not think about what you see today, but think about, 20, 30 years down the road, what could be, and use that to drive what you do right now.
Ooh. Yes.
I think collaborative methods are the only way that it's going to work. And I also think that extreme is the only language actually really understand. So sometimes we have to be extreme in our approach. I think also Nadine and to Ashon's point, that it's really important that we start talking to our residents, soon to come gentrified communities about clear titles, making sure that they know who's the rightful owner of their home, educating them on wealth perspectives and how to put wills into place. Short story, I know sometimes we start getting those letters in the mail that says, hey, if you sell me your house, we'll give you $500,000. And most people, that come from where I come from, we've never seen $500,000 at one time in our $100,000 in your life. So when you start getting these weights, the agenda of gentrification, explaining that to people and empowering them to maintain their properties and to make sure that their titles are clear, so that when they meet the eyes of their older individual, that their children and their grandchildren can actually take on those properties. But story, you have a gentleman that's living in a property in a gentrified community. He's been living there for 20 years after his sister's country, and then they find out that they're actually the rightful owner of this property, and that, hey, I really need some money, and putting out, and now uncle no longer able to live, that he's called home for his entire life, basically. So getting those, you know, the clear title established, huge of empowerment to kind of mitigate gentrification.
Clear title is good, and then also making sure that it goes somewhere, right? So we're all gonna die one day. When you die, what is the plan for your stuff? Where is it gonna go? Who's it gonna get passed down to? So you need to have, you know, your estate plan in place, whether that be your will or your trust. But so, you know, and it's oftentimes family members don't even know that they own a portion of the property, and other family members end up selling, and before you know it, you have a majority partner that's not a non-family member, that's a developer moving into town and now just bought your house, or is going to end up forcing you to sell because there wasn't, you know, planning for how that asset would stay in the family. So
Yeah,
Other than the wills, how do you explain to someone that you need to plan for this? These are hard conversations to have, but the idea of holding on to that house or the idea of generational wealth is something that a lot of minorities don't really hold on to, at least what I've seen. But to educate people to say that, no, you need to hold on to this because one day somebody's gonna wanna take it, right? But then there's that question of, well, here's $500,000. That check is a lot of money, right? How do you weigh the pros and cons of that?
I mean, I would respond by saying that when one is given an offer and the offer is very tempting, I think it's helpful if you help them to understand that the first offer isn't necessarily the best offer. If you're able to reach someone and give them advice, because when it comes to neighborhoods that are in transition, your property is probably worth 3 times the amount of the initial offer. So it's important to help people to understand that they shouldn't just cave in, you know, so early and just accept the first thing that comes to them. You know, I don't want to get biblical, nice discussion, but you know, we're talking about gentrification, but you know, gentrification is in the Bible. I mean, if you consider the story of Jacob and Esau, you know, Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of porridge. So I mean, so again, I mean, it's all about holding on to what you have, understanding the value of what you have, and making sure that you experience the material benefit of it. And so the only reason why I made that analogy is because sometimes we need to leverage the institutions that we do have that probably represent the places that we confide in, that we see as being places that we trust. And sometimes churches, if nothing else, if they offer charge statements to their parishioners, that can go a long way towards helping residents to be resilient as these transitions start to occur.
You know, Carlton, you mentioned something about understanding the value what you have, and all I could think about was those terms that they used originally for redlining, right? Like hazard, undesirable, you know, people who weren't credit worthy, minorities. How do you understand the value of that neighborhood when those are the labels that are placed on your culture, your people in the area that you live in? So it kind of goes back to, and kind of what we've all been talking about is the culture, the education, and the messaging. Because as soon as we start shifting the messaging, as soon as we call it Midtown, it's something different. It's no longer undesirable. It's no longer hazardous. But those messages, those words shift and change and define the value, I think, that we in the community and people place on these areas that end up being gentrified.
I appreciate your question, Jessica, because I think it's important that we control our own narratives. We have to control our own messaging. When it comes to value, the interesting thing about value is that so much of it is actually just artificial. So depending on who is making the assessment, you know, they can ding you and depreciate your value. They can say praiseworthy things and they can appreciate the value, and no improvement has been made to the asset whatsoever. So, I mean, value of a property or of a structure is such a tenuous thing. I mean, in the sense that, how much of it is real and how much of it is just monopoly money. And so this is one of the things I really appreciate about the National Organization of Minority Architects. I mean, in the fact that they understand the importance of framing very carefully their narrative, being the master of it, and asserting the fact that there is value in who we are as practitioners. And that same type of ethic needs to translate in terms of how we work with residents and with communities, so that persons understand that you don't have to look at your community for what it is. You can see it for what it can actually be.
But not only your community, people tend to think of themselves by what they have, right? So maybe the value of their community, but also the value they see in themselves as to having what they have, right? So if you feel like your community is not valuable, is it maybe that transcends or possibly could transcend to you not feeling valuable yourself, right? You're getting these labels as minority, you're getting these labels as hazardous. That has to do something to your mind to tell you that, well, I don't matter, right? So then I think the next thing we need to also do is change that mindset of how we view ourselves and build that up, so that translates to building up our community as well. Thoughts on that?
I don't want to take up more bandwidth, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. My undergraduate degree is in social work, and social work has a micro level perspective and it has a macro level perspective. And so the points of how we see value in ourselves, there's so much messaging that we receive that we're bombarded by because of the media and because of any number of different sources that tend to say, what is of value, what is appreciated, and what is not. And again, we have to be prepared to combat that. The whole reason why we have Black newspapers is because historically the white newspapers always characterized minority communities in a certain way, or minority individuals in a certain way, as being criminal or whatnot. And so because of that, many Black entrepreneurs saw an opportunity to basically control the narrative and to put out a product that there was demand for. And so again, there's a psychology here, there's a sociology here, there's a conditioning here that we have to fight against. The beautiful thing is once you understand how the game is being played, you can correct it. But you have to peel the layers of the onion back and basically understand and get to the root cause of it. I mean, if you only look at it at the surface level and you only take it at face value, then yeah, you may believe anything that people say. But the reality is that even when it comes to communities, I mean, one of the dangerous narratives as a planner is the fact that often we go to conferences and we see people talk about places that are successful, but we never see places that reflect us. And I've spent most of my career telling the narratives of minority leaders, men and women, who have been proactive in guiding the changes within their communities rather than reacting to them. And so when you reach an audience and you share with them these stories in terms of how we're actually driving the changes within our own communities and we're successful at it, the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina is a $300 million success story, and an African-American actually was the driver of that project, and the neighborhood didn't gentrify. You start to turn on light bulbs. And so we have to be the voices and the agents to basically sell the truth and help make sure that the people that we care about understand that there's a broader perspective beyond just what they're constantly fed.
I just want to echo that, Carlton and Nadine. I don't really have a point, but I agree wholeheartedly with what Carlton said. And I think it's almost, not even almost, it's really sad that we as Black and African-American people in this country sustain and develop the culture. We are this country for free, and like Angela Rye said, and we have to question, who we are. and our abilities and how great we are, and we get these labels put on us, but we are literally heartbeat nation. So sad, you know, to kind of hear that, but I think that's where it comes into play, that we have to be the change agents in our community. Once somebody knows, you know, we start, you know, dropping those what I like to call jewels on individuals. If you have great awakening, so to speak, you start realizing, hey, you know, we are the culture of this nation, and we created all these things. And so once we start kind of dropping those jewels on people around us, I think it changes the perspective of individuals. I'm getting something telling me my internet is breaking up, so I'm sorry. Unstable.
It's okay.
But yeah, I just wanted to drop that point in there. But
yeah, if we could value, you know, our own communities more, and you know, I'm speaking, I'm kind of like stabbing myself in the heart too at the same time. We can contribute to that a little bit, you know, individually, you know, when we take the move to the suburbs, and, you know, we take all of our resources with us, and, you know, I'm not knocking anybody for making that decision. You know, you have to, you know, also decide what's best for your family, your household. But, you know, I can just tell a personal story. You know, when my wife and I were choosing a house, I mean, we probably had a choice. I mean, we could have bought a nice house in a up and coming neighborhood, and chosen to fix it up and make that investment, or, you know, move out, get the nice new house, you know, in a nicer area, what we perceive as a nicer area. And, you know, we made the latter choice. It was a very difficult choice, but, you know, we made that choice, and so many of us make those types of choices. You know, if more of us made the former choice, and, you know, it's on an individual level, but, you know, if we actually took the time to look at, you know, what are the pros and cons, and, you know, if some of us saw more pros in saying, you know, instead of taking our resources with us, we're going to keep it, or we're going to move it into this riskier community, or what we think is riskier, and, you know, we're going to do it together, and that lifts up the community without, you know, displacing or changing the identity completely of that community. You know, that can happen. And I'll just throw one more thing kind of on an academic standpoint. If you read, there's a blog called Strong Towns. I don't know if any planners online, or you might be familiar with it. If you're not, check it out. But they look all the time at how, you know, areas we consider poor or run down, how they perform way above what they're perceived in terms of, you know, what they contribute to a city's bottom line, versus the areas that we think are nice that are really a drag on resources. You know, all those strip malls and stuff, you know, and the burbs, that's a drag on resources. But, you know, our neighborhoods where there's, you know, the nice house next to the small apartment building and the corner store right in the middle of the neighborhood, those actually contribute to the city's bottom line much more, you know, than the big mall. And you don't even think about it, you know, that's value, you know, and taking that, saying, you know, your neighborhood has value, has immense value. This is how your neighborhood performs compared to the neighborhood you think is nicer performs. And then, you know, taking that message to your city council and saying, you know, my neighborhood is contributing more than your neighborhood. You know, why are they getting more resources? You know, you need to pour more resources into our community that's already contributing more and not getting as much back. I mean, and, you know, kind of making that change. And, you know, I think, you know, having those types of conversations, you know, in our churches, in our neighborhood community meetings, and showing those graphics, you know, can really open people's eyes and say, you know, we have immense value. And, you know, that can start to change the narrative. And we can, those of us, you know, that have been entrusted with these great degrees and, you know, eloquent speech, you know, we can do that.
So I wanted to ask you guys this question. I know I met you guys a few days ago and we've been talking ever since. But there's one question that came to mind and I want an answer from each of you. If you could finish this statement in regards to redlining, in regards to gentrification, don't get mad, get what? How would you finish that to someone?
I'll say, don't get mad, buy the block. Get your friends together, get your church group together, start pulling resources together. Maybe I'm the only lawyer in the group, but somebody else knows finance, and start buying back the block. Don't get mad, just start get in the game and start buying back the block. Get in the game.
I was gonna say busy, but that was gonna be, get busy. Get busy doing what Jessica said, buying the block.
I must say, align yourself with people who share your vision.
So stoic, Carlton, like very. Ashon, what is your thoughts?
I mean, I love get in the game, get busy and, go vote. I mean, and put people in position that share your vision for your community. If you have time, and I mean, if you have time before the change happens, start changing those that are in position to make decisions.
Oh, I like this from the chat. Somebody said, don't get mad, organize. See, you guys are good. I would have said, don't get mad, get pissed. Get mad enough to do something. Don't just say you're mad, get pissed. Okay, so.
Thank you for saying that, because I don't knock being mad. I mean, sometimes being mad is a good motivator, and we shouldn't just frame it as simple as being optimistic or pessimistic. And I think sometimes people do need to get mad before they can actually focus in order on some solutions. So.
All right, everybody. Yes. Jaime, you're breaking up a little bit.
I don't know what's wrong. I was saying a lot of change comes from that place of anger, of being pissed off, or wanting, like, so upset, ready to some type.
All right, there are a few questions that came in through the chat. I'm gonna see if I can go and look them up. And I thank everyone for commenting or putting any questions in the chat. While everybody's here, please let me know what your thoughts are. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna reach back up and see what are some questions. Ooh, here's a question. Question for the group. Redevelopment of Black areas happens when someone with significant funds uses their financial and social capital to bring about large-scale changes. If Black people, some of whom that have moved away from their neighborhoods, don't come together to do the redevelopment that honors the history and heritage of the area, is all our talking in vain? Because to expect non-Black people to act in the best interest of Black people communities is a tall task.
It is. I agree. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying as we went into questions, but it's about us getting back together. If we don't get back together, then what do we have to complain about when our community is no longer there, when we can no longer afford the homes in the community, when our families are displaced, when the corner store we grew up going to is no longer there? Like, who do we have to blame if it's not us that are willing to reinvest in revitalizing our community and being the change that we want to see? So I think that's exactly it. I don't think that we can rely on anybody else to do it. It may happen. It may not look like what you want it to look like. It's going to look like Midtown or Uptown West or whatever they want to call it next. But yeah, I think a lot is lost if it's not us that's going to be the change.
Would anybody like to add to that? Just
Well,
listening
I'm
in.
encouraged by the fact that there are examples where we have balanced the goals of economic development and cultural development in our communities. The 18th and Vine Jazz District in Kansas City, Missouri is a wonderful example of that, where they have preserved the legacy of Negro League Baseball, the Kansas City Monarchs, as well as the creation of the Negro Leagues in Kansas City, Kansas, as well as the jazz contributions of Count Basie, Charlie Parker, and many other luminaries from that era. But the reason why that was done is because a minister from the United Methodist Church of Kansas City, wasn't even a Kansas City resident, who was born in Houston, Emmanuel Cleaver, realized that the attributes that they have in this neighborhood are worth protecting. And so as a result of that, when he became a city council member, he said that the city of Kansas City needs to balance the goals of economic development and cultural development. He also said that economic development shouldn't just be about encouraging more investment in the places that are already stable.
Mhm.
He insisted that redevelopment also needs to occur in the places that are lower income and are vulnerable, but they need to be done in a way that's going to be respectful and responsive to those assets that are important towards a sense of place. And so part of this is an issue of is an issue of the fact that we have to rethink how we approach redevelopment. We have to calibrate our approaches. We shouldn't just look at it as just being a one-size-fits-all solution. And so I respond to the question with the fact that we should be respectful and we should be good listeners and we should take the time to be a little bit more tolerant and accepting. I mean, especially in a country such as ours, where diversity really is our strength, as opposed to only trying to encourage a form of colonialism through development.
We have another question that came in from Ms. Nia Hope. What mechanisms can community leaders advance to help more people understand the nuance of land use, zoning, planning, etc.? And
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, community newspapers oftentimes will have sort of summaries that'll come out that kind of explain, okay, what's happening with this new zoning decision. Your local elected official sometimes will have like a newsletter that summarizes key decisions that council may have made. That sort of summarizes things in a way that people can sort of understand what planning and zoning decisions are happening. And then sometimes you can also just go into if you can make an appointment and go into their office and sit down and have them talk to you, have them explain it to you, point it out on a map. This is what's happening. This is what's going on with the master plan or redistricting or whatever. And then kind of going back to what I was talking about before, is just engaging local nonprofits or local businesses that cater to the community, that are community-based organizations, might have that information as well.
Yeah, I know that they do. I mean, planners do like these charrettes and things like that. But if I told somebody, 8 units an acre versus 24, I mean, most people don't. I mean, what does that mean? But here's a picture. This is what 8 units an acre means for your lots. If you wanted to develop it, this is what you could build. I think, turn it into something that somebody can relate to. Some of that language, I think, really helps, in a meeting, in a community meeting, where, you can, do that breakdown and really explain how these things work.
I have another question here from Melvin Mitchell. Some very key points have been made concerning increased community involvement in local political action and voting for local officials. Another key concern is the development of tools and strategies that are designed to encourage neighborhood involvement and participation in the planning and development processes. Should we try to promote the establishment of neighborhood planning groups that can address local needs and present their concerns to elected bodies in a formal manner?
In my response is, I think Melvin makes a good point, and that needs to occur. I also think there needs to be a change in philosophy in terms of how we approach the manner in which we plan and development. A lot has been market driven, and obviously we're in a market driven society, but we also know, and as we consider the trends associated with development, I mean, sometimes development has been driven by sustainability goals. I think we're on the cusp of an era where we need to actually talk a little bit more intentionally and deliberately about equity. And so that's the reason why I started my points by saying we need to make a shift in philosophy. We need to make the mental leap to understand that a lot of what we claim is sustainable, a lot of what we claim is economically resilient is not, if it's not equitable. And so I think that's our unfinished business at this point. And it gets at the issues that Melvin Mitchell raised in his question in terms of organizing and in terms of working with residents. I mean, we have to become masters of those particular skill sets that we've often left in the periphery. And that has to become central to how we practice, whether we are planners or architects or urban designers or historic preservationists. We have to become more proficient in addressing equity and understand that this is very central to our respective disciplines, just as much as ensuring that we have a healthy, strong market.
Would anyone like to add to that? I'm looking for more questions. Give me a second. Doesn't seem like we are having more questions as of yet. I'll give it a few more minutes. However, Stephanie Bender says, planning rules should always be made visible. Thank you, Ashon. Which is true. Let's see, what else?
If I could add to what Carlton was saying about equity, just by way of example, in planning like housing, I'm in the housing world, so you know everybody wants to do accessory dwelling units as a way of expanding affordable housing. If you look at, you know, communities, you look at the rules, say rules around, I'm just giving an example. If they say, you know, in your planning code that lots only a certain size can have accessory dwelling units. If you look at a lot of our communities, you have these kind of really small lots or, you know, irregularly shaped lots. And so you kind of have an issue where, you know, those communities don't have the opportunity to put an accessory dwelling unit on their property. So, you know, if I have a lot that's now non-conforming, that's a term, and you know, I'm in it, you know, I want to put an accessory dwelling unit, or I want to live in the ADU and let my adult children and their families live in the main house. Number one, I can't put the ADU on my property because it's too small according to the rules. And also, I might be in violation because I'm living in the ADU, I'm the owner, and I'm renting out the main house. So those are the types of things when you start thinking about equity and saying, you know, how can we make it so that, you know, everybody has the same level of opportunity, you know, really looking at how our rules affect certain groups. You know, if all the African-American communities mostly confined in areas that have non-conforming lots or small lots, you know, how can we make the rules, adjust them so that they have the same opportunity as other folks to put that ADU on their lot, or they have the same opportunity to say live in an ADU and put somebody in the main house. You know, those are the types of things when we start thinking about equity and planning and, you know, taking, you know, a big idea and really making it something practical to benefit people. I think that's where we need to go.
Well, a few things, Ashon. Not everybody knows what ADU is and what a non-conforming lot is. So can you?
I'm sorry. I should explain. So accessory dwelling unit. So if you say you have a house and you have a apartment above your garage, that apartment above the garage is the accessory unit. It's usually something that's smaller than the main unit. It's an accessory, to the main property. So, it adds to it. And so, a non-conforming lot would be something that, someone was able to build on in years past, but as the zoning code changed, you can't build on that lot now because of some reason. It might be too small. You might not have enough, space between the next house. And so if that house was torn down, you couldn't come back and build back because now you're not conforming. And so, that's, how we get into start thinking about, equity and how do we, address those things so that, we can rebuild or we have the same opportunities as other people have.
Well, everybody, these were excellent points you made tonight, and I definitely want to thank everybody for joining today and taking out the time. I'm going to ask each one of you what would be your lasting thoughts? Carlton, especially with you speaking with part 1 and part 2, if you can give advice to communities that are starting to be redlined or communities that are experiencing gentrification, what would be your last remarks or your last pieces of advice for them?
My last advice would be everything we need is in our house. Based on 20 years of experience, there are faith-based developers, there are minority professional associations, whether it be the Planning and Black Community Division or the National Organization of Minority Architects, and they are very clear case examples of us doing it and making the change that we seek. A lot of it has been done by the environmental justice movement out of necessity because it was about making sure that we saw the problems that everyone else wanted to render invisible. So if your community is dealing with the legacy of redlining, if your community is faced with the pressure of gentrification, understand that the solutions are there. Do not believe people when they say, well, there's nothing that I can do. It's not my purview. It's not my responsibility. There are solutions that can be tailored towards your specific situation, but we have to do the research in order to identify them. But they exist, they're all around us. And that's what I would encourage.
Jaime, your thoughts?
I would say utilize your resources. We are in a really great time right now. I like to say, what a time to be alive, where we have people who are buying off of being our allies. So I think we should make them, kind of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. In addition to that, we have social media that has made our world so much smaller, where we can connect with people that we probably never would have been able to connect with before. So that allows us an opportunity to organize and create and and other opportunities in other areas that we can use as models and our area, wherever you may be. So I say utilize your resources. Utilize the things that we have, right in front of us. And I guess that's kind of echoing what Carlton said, is that everything we need is in the house. We already have what we need. And it's really just the point of utilizing those things. So that would be my final word.
Ms. Jessica Burns.
I would say just back to get in the game and be strategic about it, right? We can't do all things, but and maybe we have multiple causes and different priorities, but we can get behind one, we can strategize behind one, we can pull resources behind one and really start to move the needle a little bit. So everybody can do their part. And then looking into reinvest, how can I reinvest in my community, whether it's through your business, through your neighbors, through your local community banks, organizations. How can I be a part in revitalizing and shaping what this revitalization effort looks like?
And last but not least, Mr. Ashon Nesbitt.
I don't know if I can add to anything that's already been said, but yeah, I would say organize, you know, equity in a different sense, you know, get ownership, you know, and, you know, don't, as we can get biblical, don't despise small beginnings. You know, start small. It might be, you know, one small property and a couple of folks, and, you know, start your own movement. You know, you just don't know who you can inspire, you know, just one person, just a group of us coming together to buy one property could really start, you know, a domino effect or a snowball effect, and, you know, get more people to do the same. So, you know, somebody has to be courageous. You know, the pioneer doesn't always have to be a white person. It can be you. It could be, you know, one of us that's pioneering and starting the change in our own community. So get in the game, get busy, get pissed, get going.
To work. Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who logged in, wrote in a question. The last things I would love to say to you guys as a moderator, and having the pleasure of speaking to each one of these panelists, and what I've learned is that our voices are strong. We are important. We just need to come together and make sure we are heard and heard loud. As minorities, they take us for granted and they count us out all the time. But we can prove them wrong. We've been proving them wrong for a long time, and we'll continue to do so. So get to work, get busy, get organized, and get pissed. Thank you so much. Tim, leave it off to you.
All right, thank you, Nadine. And thank you, Carlton, Jaime, Jessica, and Ashon for serving as panelists. We're excited to have you as a part of something that we believe will be a great benefit to not only Black architects, but the entire field of architecture and to our communities. Your participation and comments have been enlightening, insightful, and motivating. So thank you for your investment into this conversation and this process. We also encourage our listening audience to go to BAM Orlando's website to find the link for this episode and previous episodes of Inside Voices, Black Thoughts. With that, I bid everyone a good evening and thank you for participating.